This is the Speaking of Writers podcast. I'm Steve Richards. Jeffrey Archer is back with a new thriller, joining the list of international bestsellers Archer has accrued over his long career spanning 45 years and 275 million, count 'em, books sold. As far from William Warwick's normal patch in London, in one of the most luxurious cities on earth, a $1 billion deal is about to go badly wrong. A lavish night out is about to end in murder, and the British government is about to be plunged into crisis. Meanwhile, back in England, Lord Hartley, the latest in a line of peers going back over 200 years, lies dying. But his will triggers an inheritance with explosive consequences. Two deaths, continents apart, no obvious connection. So why are they both at the center of a master criminal's plot for revenge? An Eye for an Eye is the penultimate in the William Warwick series, a remarkable character study of two men, William Warwick and Miles Faulkner, and a modern take on the Holmes Moriarty dynamic. Warwick is now a chief superintendent at Scotland Yard, now head of the Royalty and Diplomatic Protection Unit, and Miles Faulkner is behind bars. In this dance of morality between these two men, Archer has opened a rich narrative possibilities in the dark interlocking network of power and money around the world, from arms deals to the art market. Jeffrey Archer, whose novels include the Clifton Chronicles, the William Warwick novels, and Kane and Abel, is one of the world's best-selling authors, famous for his discipline as a writer who works on up to 14 drafts of each book. Jeffrey also brings a vast amount of insider knowledge to his books. Whether it's his own career in politics, his passionate interest in art, or the wealth of fascinating background detail inspired by the extraordinary network of friends he has built over a lifetime at the heart of Britain's establishment. His novels provide a fascinating glimpse into a range of closed worlds. A member of the House of Lords, the author is married to Dame Mary Archer, and they have two sons, two granddaughters, and three grandsons. He splits his time between London, Grantchester, and Cambridge, and Mallorca, where he writes the first draft of each new novel. I'm very happy to have Jeffrey Archer join me here on the Speaking of Writers podcast. Jeffrey, welcome.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Steve, for having me on the show.
So I'm going to start with Mallorca. And why Mallorca for the first draft of your novels? Why that special place?
Good question. I many years ago, a dear friend offered me his home in Mallorca so that I could get away from the noise of London and the problem of always having so many kind invitations and things to do, like the theatre and opera and music, which distracts me. So he offered me his home, and I went over. I fell in love with Mallorca, and 15 years ago, I built my own home, which overlooks the sea, overlooks the Bay of Palma, and there is no noise other than the waves and a few seagulls.
Very nice. So what inspired you to write this book?
Well, I've always been fascinated with Thomas Jefferson. I think he's one of the world's, well, he's one of America's greatest presidents, and a fascinating man. And I discovered that when he was in Paris, he handwrote the Declaration of Independence, and he included 2 extra paragraphs, which were turned down by Congress. The first one concerned slavery, the abolition of, and the second one, the relationship with King George III. If those 2 clauses had gone through, there is reason to believe, and they were only rejected in Congress by 1 vote. There's reason to believe you never would have had a civil war, number 1, and 2, slavery would have been abolished. Now, he wrote this what I discovered in the research is that Jefferson, while he was in Paris, made a close friend of a Mr. Hartley, a British MP. And they were in regular correspondence. And I have met the ancestor of Mr. Hartley. Not only is he the ancestor, Willie Hartley, but he lives in the same house as his distinguished parliamentarian great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather did. In fact, they've lived in that house, can you believe it, for 500 years.
Wow.
Now, he wrote in one of the letters that he was handwriting in Paris the Declaration of Independence. It's out there somewhere, Steve. And if anyone could find it, it's worth 100 million. They sold quite recently in Pennsylvania a Franklin copy for 7.7 million. So if you could get your hands on the real thing, you'd have 100 million. And I think Mr. Faulkner might get his hands on it.
He just might.
But all will be revealed in an eye for an eye.
Yes. Let's talk about Faulkner. How did you create Mr. Faulkner?
Well, I'm fascinated by having a criminal who was highly intelligent, what we in England call a white-collar criminal, and then having this battle from an early age with William Warwick, when William is starting his career in the Metropolitan Police, slowly working him up, and as you pointed out, he's now a chief superintendent, and in the next book, he'll be a commander, and we'll see whether he makes it to be commissioner of the Metropolitan Police. He's up against a man who's determined to stop him at any cost, because William has caused Faulkner to go to jail for 3 years, and while he was in jail, he sat there plotting how he would get his revenge.
And while we're on characters, for those who don't know and might be new to Warwick, how did you create William?
Well, when I wrote the first book, Nothing Ventured, I realized I had to have help from a retired police officer. And I went to a service at Christmas about 7 years ago, and there was a young officer, young by my standards, because I'm 84, who was head of the murder squad. And he had retired in his 40s, in his late 40s, after 20 years in the force, because of what he described as one murder too many. He was reading a lesson in the church service I was at, and I approached him afterwards and asked if he would become my chief researcher so that I couldn't make any technical mistakes in the book. He turned me down. He said he wasn't ready yet to face that world. But a year later, when I'd finished the first draft, he did agree. And so he became, his name is Johnny Sutherland, a very remarkable man. He became the chief researcher, but I also based William Warwick on him. So when you see William Warwick, you see him.
You have a passionate interest in art. Art plays a role in this book. How did you develop that passionate interest in art?
At the age of 18, when I come from a small town near Bristol in Somerset, England, I fell in love with a girl called Jill, and the only way I could get to see her was to go to art galleries. And as time moved on, I fell out of love with her and fell in love with art. And it's been my mistress now for 60 years. I've been a collector. You can see behind me a William Russell Flint there. You can see 2 Moorcroft vases. And my home is full of art. I buy a new picture with every book. But of course, that has allowed me to learn about it as well, because one of my dearest friends runs a major art gallery in London. Indeed, we're having dinner together tonight. And we talk art all the time. And so I'm picking up information. For example, I found out last week, can you believe it, Steve, that Sotheby's last year only made a profit of 2 or 3%. The art market is in problems at the moment, and Christie's and Sotheby's are battling just to keep their heads above water. Well, I didn't know that. I remember them when they were a massive success story, or perceived by the public to be a massive success story. And so I'm always picking up information. You never know when you're going to use it, Steve. That's not what you know. Then suddenly a paragraph comes along and you think, wow, I'm going to put that in because the public will be fascinated by that. And so I'm gathering all the time.
Chatting with Jeffrey Archer, An Eye for an Eye is his new novel. How did you become a writer?
By mistake. I entered the British House of Commons at the age of 29 as a young member of Parliament, on my way to becoming Prime Minister, like everyone else who enters the House of Commons. And I've invested very foolishly in a Canadian company called Aquablast. I invested $400,000, 200,000 of my own, and 200,000 I borrowed. I lost every penny and was out of work. And I sat down and wrote Not a Penny More, Not a Penny Less, which I must tell you, because I know you'll be excited, Steve, made $5,000 and sold 3,000 copies. And my wife said, don't you think it's time you went out and got a proper job? And then I sat down and yes, she may well have been right. I sat down and wrote Kane and Abel, and my whole life changed overnight.
Jeffrey, do you remember the moment when you first learned that language had power?
Yes, it's a good question. I suppose it's the moment when you go to #1 on the New York Times bestsellers list. You don't think, particularly as an Englishman, that's something that a novelist will achieve, or nonfiction as well. The lady I had the pleasure of working for, Margaret Thatcher, of course, went to #1 nonfiction, and she used to tease me about being #1 fiction. She said, fiction.
You're a very disciplined writer. You write up to 14 drafts of each book. Why the number 14? Is that a writing quirk of yours?
No, I think it's around 13, 14, 15. I get up every morning. I work 6 to 8, 10 to 12, 2 to 4, 6 to 8, in bed by 10. The first draft, which I do in Mallorca, will take 5 weeks, about 300 hours. By the time I've got to the 14th draft or thereabouts, I will have done 1,000 hours, and that's when I send it to the publisher.
Does writing energize you or exhaust you?
Gosh, I think it's both. I think I love it. I was thinking this afternoon when I was writing before I came to you, how lucky I am to be able to sit down and just enjoy it. It's a very great privilege. If it was a chore, if I wasn't enjoying it, oh my God, what an ordeal it would be if your publisher said, we need another book, and you were to say, but I haven't got any ideas and I don't want to write. The truth is, I can't wait to write. I'm very lucky. And so the answer to your question really is, I love it. And I'm very lucky to have discovered that this simple talent of telling a story can be so rewarding.
How have you evolved as a writer over the years?
Well, I started very young. Well, I say very young. I was 34, so it's 45 years ago. I started at the age of 34, and I wrote my first book, as I think everybody writes their first book, just picked up a pen and got on with it. And it wasn't until Kane and Abel, when I had the very great privilege of being edited by the legendary Corley Smith, who'd edited J.D. Salinger. And to sit with him was like a tutorial at Oxford. You just learnt every minute of the day. And I think the evolving, to use your words, came when I sat with the great man, and he guided me and helped me. I once said to him, what do you think is the difference between a great writer and a great writer and a great editor? And he said, the first draft.
Mm. Mm. What genres do you especially enjoy reading, and which do you tend to avoid?
Genres, I wouldn't say I went in for genres as much as people. So I love a good story. So if someone tells a tale and I have to turn the page, I love that. So historically in England, of course, we have produced giant storytellers, right back to Dickens and before. And of course, there'll be those who tell you, the real academics will tell you, that Shakespeare was the greatest storyteller of them all. If you had never seen Romeo and Juliet, you'd be sitting on the edge of your seat waiting to find out how it ends. It's not just the language, it was his ability to hold you into the story. So I think language and story are very important indeed. And when you get both, then you get something I love. My hero, to try and answer your question, is Stefan Zweig, the great Austrian writer who left Austria because of Hitler, went to live in New York, wrote Beware of Pity, which I consider to be a masterpiece. In fact, I don't think he wrote any book or short story or novella that wasn't of the highest quality. So the answer to your question is I get up each morning wanting to be Stefan Zweig.
All right, that probably answers my next question. Stefan Zweig, if you were organizing a literary dinner party, which three writers, dead or alive, do you invite? Would it be Stefan Zweig, Shakespeare, and Dickens?
They would certainly make it. I'd be fascinated. I'd be fascinated to meet Agatha Christie and find out what it was that such simple storytelling, but such genius, and how she worked. The three you mentioned, I'd be fascinated to ask them how they worked. Jane Austen, in her little room upstairs, not telling her mother and father that she was writing a book. There's so many where you wonder where the genius came from. Rebecca, what a masterpiece. She again, unfashionable to be a woman writer when Daphne du Maurier was around. Now, of course, if you look at the top 100 bestsellers, 70 of them are women.
Yes. Yes, very much so. Are you hard at work on another novel? And if so, can you give us a sneak peek into what it's about?
You mean the one after this one, Steve?
Yes, which I saw a note that this could be the last Warwick one. Is that true?
Yes, it'll be the last one, when you will discover whether he does or does not become Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police. But by then, his job will be, he will be the commanding officer in charge of security at the London Olympic Games in 2012. And one or two things will go wrong, which the public didn't know about at the time.
We will leave it at that. A great tease for the next one coming from Jeffrey Archer, but we enjoy this one now and can enjoy it. An eye for an eye. And Jeffrey has a website too, jeffreyarcher.com, where you can connect with him online. Thank you so much for joining me.
Always a pleasure. Thank you very much. One does like dealing with top professionals, Steve. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that, Jeffrey. And this is the Speaking of Writers podcast.